Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Vanguard. This is episode 3 of our Chris Hedges Wages of Rebellion book club. We're really enjoying this book so far. Chris has a lot of really interesting musings and historical examples to bring up about revolution, revolts, etc., successful and unsuccessful in the past. And I think one of the most interesting thing about this chapter was kind of his dissection of the ways various revolutionary movements have failed, and even the ones that have succeeded, how they maybe could have succeeded to an even greater extent as far as liberation is concerned. So lots of really interesting strategical conversation going on here, and just really important stuff to be thinking of as leftists.
Yeah, and one of the things that I thought was really productive about this chapter is, all of us are really concerned about the revolution. We think about it a lot, or at least if you're in the kind of circle that Gavin and I are, you dream about it, right? You think about what it will be like the day that we liberate ourselves from this capitalist machine, not just us, but, all people. But I think that one of the, I guess most insightful things that Hedges did right from the jump of this chapter is he talks about the goals of the counter-revolutionary and how the counter-revolutionary will always emerge as a byproduct of any kind of revolutionary struggle. And I wanted to read this first quote, which says, "The goal of the counter-revolutionary is to physically eradicate the insurgents' logistical base of operations, disrupt their communication, and shatter their organization. Counter-revolutionaries seek to dry up popular, financial, and material support for their revolutionaries. They hunt down and decapitate leaders. Counter-revolutionaries create rival organizations to discredit and purge the rebel leadership and infiltrate the movement to foster internal divisions and rivalries. They provoke the movement to foster internal divisions and rivalries." I wrote that twice. "They provoke the movement by forming front groups that carry out repugnant acts to alienate the wider populace from the insurgency." And basically, these are all of the tactics that they will use to discredit, to undermine, and to pacify any kind of groundswell of protest movement that gets going. And even in my limited experience of protesting, Occupy happened, it was something that I watched on TV. It wasn't something that I participated in. But if you view this even through the domestic lens of the George Floyd protest, the Black Lives Matter protest, going back to Ferguson's, these are the kind of, techniques and tactics that people are doing. There were agent provocateurs, and even though there were also just regular pissed off people at those protests, right? And they do the thing where all these people are chanting "defund the police," and then the counter-revolutionaries come and say, "Oh, well, what we actually mean is reform. We actually mean that we need to give the police more money and more resources to do this shit." Those are the counter-revolutionaries.
This is definitely something to keep an eye out for, and definitely something we see, especially in the digital age, happening too. Chris Hedges talks about eradicating the insurgents' logistical base of operations, disrupting their communication, shattering their organization. In some ways, internet organizing has made this harder to get around for protest movements and all that. But in certain ways, it's also made it easier for the government to infiltrate, or for different intelligence agencies to spy on the communications of revolutionary groups. Even groups like Black Lives Matter have been known to have been infiltrated and spied on. So, this is definitely something that's happening. Definitely something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, and it feeds right well into his next quote, which is, counterinsurgency campaigns, although they involve arms and weapons and are primarily about winning hearts and minds, the goal is to win back, or at least render passive, a disaffected population. And the tactics employed by our intelligence operatives abroad are not dissimilar from those employed by our intelligence operatives at home. In fact, these operatives are frequently the same people, Hedges writes. And I think that this part is really important too, because the main goal of the counterinsurgency is to make the revolution seem either untenable or just something that you don't want to be a part of. And typically violence has that kind of fight or flight, but most people just fly, right? They just don't want to be a part of it. It discredits you. It invalidates a lot of your arguments, right? And that's not to say that Gavin and I submit to this, horseshit idea that the state has a monopoly on violence for any kind of just or righteous reason. This all comes down to hearts and minds, right? Which we'll get into a little more as the podcast goes on. As Gavin was mentioning, we have to keep people with us, and the agent provocateurs are there to basically keep people from seeing us as the people who are moral, right? The people who are ethical. And if you set a cop car on fire, right, it's easier for the cops to turn around and be like, look at these fucking hooligans. You know what I'm saying? Does a cop car deserve to be set on fire? I think you could make the argument for hell yeah, it does. But you have to start thinking about, the movement more broadly. You have to start thinking, even though he's an imperfect historical analogy, like Jackie Robinson, right? Putting up with it, Martin Luther King style, offering the other cheek, that kind of shit.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one that I go back and forth on quite a bit. I think it's a really nuanced and interesting question. And I was actually telling you, Zach, kind of joking around, that I feel like I kind of be convinced of either approach given on who's talking to you. Some people have a very convincing, defense for the more like, let's get intense, let's really make a ruckus kind of approach. And some people like Chris Hedges will make an extremely compelling case for complete and utter pacifism, essentially, surrendering all arms at any sense of resistance. I think there's a quote in this chapter where he says that while dying with arms may seem more beautiful than without, we have this romantic nature about us. We have these ideas of, glorious rebellion and again, dying guns blazing against an oppressive state. But at the end of the day, that doesn't necessarily further the goals of the oppressed anymore. In some instances, it certainly does. But just as your average citizen, really doing that may actually set back the movement or the goals of the movement if it's not orchestrated properly, if it's done haphazardly, and if it kind of green lights this anything goes approach, which is something he talks about as well. Sometimes, sometimes this call for just anything goes will result in an unaccountability, a movement that is full of people that are, doing various things that they believe is just, but, obviously everyone has a different interpretation of what that is. So that's going to lead to a lot of crazy shit. That's something we have to reckon with as a left. That's something we have to reckon with as a movement of people that's full of, folks that are very desperate, folks that are at the end of their rope for very understandable reasons. I think it's important to unify behind strategies that are correct, not destructive.
Yeah, and this kind of gets into the meat of where you, were mentioning that you kind of are on the fence as whether or not you agree with Hedges. Obviously, he makes his point pretty well, but he actually quotes Václav Havel in this chapter multiple times. And for people who aren't familiar, he was the final president of the Czechoslovakia, and then also the first president of Czech Republic. You can read about the guy if you're curious. But anyway, all we have, as Václav Havel wrote, is our powerlessness. And that powerlessness is our strength. The ability of the movement to overthrow the corporate state depends on embracing this powerlessness. It depends on two of our most important assets: utter and complete transparency and a rigid adherence to nonviolence, including respect for private property. Now, I don't think that Hedges would argue that he has a deep moral respect for private property. I think he's made the calculation, along with others who advocate against for a mode of peaceful protest and peaceful revolution, because they think that it will cost the movement its legitimacy to engage in things like destruction of private property, which the overwhelming majority of the public does still have that, they do feel like it's immoral to judge or to, destroy public property. Now, to give the counter argument that a lot of people would say is that we need to teach those people to lose their respect for private property, and we need to teach them to demand more and create fear. I think this is a balancing act. I think that you have to move slowly over time and bring people in. If you run straight to accelerationism, I think we end up losing every single time.
Yeah, I totally agree with that point, Zach. I think that's totally accurate. And I think that, too, this brings up this interesting question and obviously a real point of hypocrisy when it comes to state power, and especially this country and its founding in general. Obviously, one of the key stories of our origin in this country, the United States of America, is the Boston Tea Party, in which many pounds of private property were destroyed by revolutionaries who were protesting these unjust taxes. Of course, that's how the country was founded, upon these premises, and that's the kind of romantic story that's taught to us in grade school on up. That's what we come to believe. But then you turn around and you turn on your television in the modern era to images of property destruction in the name of causes that frankly are more grave than taxation without representation. I mean, certainly that's worthy of protest. I'm not saying it's not, but when you're talking about human life, murder, would you not say that these things call for a similar approach? Of course, the state doesn't think so. Like I said earlier, like Hedges says, they use it as an excuse to crack down further. So it presents kind of this interesting quandary. We're taught that destruction of property and serious, resistance in that way is effective. We're taught from a very early age that that's what's necessary in order to, foster the goals of your revolution, essentially. And of course, those heroes are held up, or those people are held up as heroes, the ultimate founding fathers and oracles of democracy, fairness and freedom and all that bullshit. So, I think obviously a real hypocrisy is exposed there, but we also have to look at how much of that story of our founding is just a myth in the first place, and how and why or how should those same tactics apply to, modern day era strategy and movement. I think that's something that Hedges talks about later in this book, is how one of the most effective tactics from South African resistance was nonviolent strikes, was the majority Black population unifying behind this solidarity and deciding to use their bodies to strike, to withhold their labor and to withhold their purchasing power in order to make a real statement to the bourgeoisie. And ultimately, I think that's what really has to happen when it's a democratic movement, not a resistance of aristocratic white males, but an actual populist movement burgeoning on the streets.
Yeah, and in this next quote that we have by Václav Havel and Hedges as well, he kind of goes through and he highlights, and describes what he means by, all we have is our powerlessness. And he gives this analogy of a grocer. So Havel asserts that this is the power to live in truth while others live in lies. He gives an analogy of a grocer ordered to put up signs and follows the orders. Havel writes, imagine that one day something in our green grocer, the grocer, snaps and he stops putting up the slogans merely to ingratiate himself. He stops voting in elections he knows are a farce. He begins to say what he really thinks at political meetings, and he finds the strength in himself to express solidarity with those whom his conscience commands him to support. In this revolt, the greengrocer steps out of living within the lie. He rejects the ritual and breaks the rules of the game. He discovered once more his suppressed identity and dignity. He gives his freedom a concrete significance. His revolt is an attempt to live within the truth. The real crime, and this is Hedges now, committed is not the crime of speaking out or defying the rules, but the crime of exposing the charade. And then back to Havel. By breaking the rules of the game, he has disrupted the game as such. He has exposed it as a mere game. Basically, what it comes down to is they're providing a way that you can break this societal set of norms that he calls it truth, or the lie rather, and live your truth as a way of fracturing this game, exposing it, showing the emperor has no clothes, whatever, as opposed to providing a violent alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And of course, this last line really reminds me too of Assange, who, has been on all of our minds lately. But yeah, the real crime committed is not the crime of speaking out or defying the rules, but the crime of exposing the charade. So I think that's, very, very accurate.
Yeah. And just to get over to one more kind of more modern, we talked about it a little bit. We sort of set the stage for the response to the Occupy movement. Chris Hedges was very involved in the Occupy movement. And I think a lot of his thinking in the 2010s period and a lot of his writing was really influenced by, what he saw there. And if we pull up this excerpt, it's by a woman named Lisa Fithian, and there were as well as a number of co-authors in what was called an open letter to the Occupy movement. And they're talking about diversity of tactics, and specifically what they're looking at is whether or not it's a critique of violence in these movements. And she says, diversity of tactics becomes an easy way to avoid the wrestling with questions of strategy and accountability. It lets us off the hook for doing the hard work of debating our positions and coming to agreements about how we want to act together. It becomes a code for anything goes, and it makes it impossible for our movement to hold anyone accountable for their actions. And then we can click to the next quote because I think it flows together well. The Occupy movement includes people from a broad diversity of backgrounds, life experiences, and political philosophies. Some of us want to reform the system, and some of us want to tear it down and replace it with something better. Our one great point of agreement is our call for transparency and accountability. We stand against the corrupt institutions that broker power behind closed doors. We call to account the financial manipulators that have built billions out of the poor and middle classes. Just as we call for accountability and transparency, we ourselves must be accountable and transparent. Some tactics are incompatible with those goals, even if in other situations they might be useful, honorable, or appropriate. I think that's important. We can't be transparent behind masks. We can't be accountable for our actions we run away from. We can't maintain the security culture necessary for planning and carrying out attacks on property, and also maintain the openness that can continue to invite a true diversity of new people. We can't make alliances with groups in impacted communities, such as immigrants, if we can't make agreements about what tactics we will employ in any given action.
Yeah, I think that's a great quote, and something that I just want to highlight too from this that, harkens back to the Occupy movement, of course, but I think is just so important that we keep in mind now is that he says some of us want to reform the system and some of us want to tear it down entirely, replace it with something better. That reminds us of this constant, question we're dealing with here on the left of reform versus revolution. Is it worth it to participate in this incrementalism of electoral politics, getting people elected to various higher office so that they can, ultimately sell out, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that ultimately, as a left, we should come together, regardless of whether you believe in reform or revolution, and realize that there's a damn lot we agree on, regardless of, whether or not your approach is to tear it all down or whether it's to reform it and, try to work within the system. As he says here, there's so many things: accountability, all this stuff, transparency. We need to unite behind a certain set of demands, or else we're never going to get anywhere, and it's only going to further fracture and divide what otherwise could be a fairly, solid movement.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to kind of follow up with one final quote that I had prepared, he says, as societies unravel, as desperation becomes worldwide, it may happen that neither nonviolence or violence will do very much to alter our impending self-destruction. And that may be true. But violence, when we face near certain annihilation, can become a final affirmation of human dignity. But by then the game is over. And I wanted to get your reaction to that, Gavin, because I think that it really makes it clear that Hedges has no moral aversion, or I mean, maybe he does for personal reasons, but I think his argument with violent tactics, just as the argument from the people that wrote that Occupy piece, it's more of a strategic difference, right? Like nobody, I think under different situations, like nobody is, finger wagging their hands at the Kurds in Rojava for using an armed resistance, right? They're literally being bombed and slaughtered and killed. But fortunately, the American left isn't quite in that predicament. So I think in order to maintain viability, in order to maintain acceptability, we fall the other way. But if it's a last final affirmation of your human dignity, I think he's conceding that you have no other option.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. And I think it kind of just depends on the degree of oppression you find yourself in. Obviously, if you're captured and bound in somebody's, living room, you have the right to fight back. You have the right to self-defense. I think that's obvious. Everyone has the right to self-defense. And, when it comes to like the civil rights era, and you had these competing approaches of someone like Malcolm X and someone like Martin Luther King, I think they both obviously had so much importance, so much, real answers there. And I think ultimately it was kind of a marrying of approaches that led to real liberation. I think we see that in a lot of instances. But yeah, ultimately, I really do just think it kind of it depends on the degree of oppression. Like you said, in Rojava, where they're literally being bombed, it's a little bit of a different situation than maybe here when we're might more effectively fight with other means.
Yeah, and just to wrap, I wanted to briefly talk about something that you mentioned earlier in the podcast that I thought was really, important, and one of the, most moving parts of the chapter was where he talks about Dr. Merrick Edelman, who was a member of the Warsaw Uprising. And I just wanted to end with this quote that Edelman said, and Gavin, you can react to it, obviously, but he said that in that situation, and I didn't pull it, I'm just noticing it right here, but he said the majority of them favored an uprising. After all, humanity had agreed that dying with arms was more beautiful than without arms, which is what you said, Gavin. But he said for them, all it was about finally was that we not just let them slaughter us when our turn came. It was only a choice as to the matter of dying. And so that lets one, it devastating, obviously, the experiences of the people for the Holocaust goes without saying, but it also they were so far backed up against the wall. We're not backed up against the wall in that same way. We are not in a Warsaw ghetto. We are not, seeing our friends, family, people in our community being sent on trains with loaves of bread to be exterminated. But we obviously learn from these people and their experiences, and I think that it reinforces that while we will never go out like lambs for the slaughter if the time comes in America, of course, let's not push an accelerationist where we don't need to. Let's not lead to all of that unnecessary human suffering, because the degree to suffering is immense. We have to acknowledge that. But it is not as bad as it could be, and so we have to, calculate ourselves on the scale of human suffering. Because if you're under assured death, you're going to get a lot of people who are like, let's go out swinging. But if you're in the situation we're in the United States, if you tell everybody that signs up to be a leftist that you have to put your fucking life on the line, it's not a great recruiting speech.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also, it reminds me of something that I feel like many people on the left, many people that have these revolutionary ideas and sentiments, they don't really factor into their equation, which is that a lot of the people they need to appeal to, a lot of the other members of, yes, even the proletariat, maybe aren't in quite as desperate of a situation as they are. Often people don't reach the point where they find that revolution is necessary, or that serious of intense resistance is necessary, until they're at their wits' end, until they realize that there's no other option, or until they have a revelation that for society and for the others among us that may be less fortunate, there's no other option for them. But a lot of people simply aren't at that state yet of evolution as far as their consciousness goes, as far as their thinking on these issues, and for a variety of reasons, some more legitimate than others. And I think that some people on the left, again, some people that dabble in this thought, they don't really take that into consideration. They just assume everyone is on the same page as them. They just assume that everyone realizes the gravity of the situation and has diagnosed capitalism to be the problem, and the bourgeois class, and all this stuff, which seems so obvious to us. But there is a lot of education and clarity and awareness that needs to be brought to all that stuff. And I think you're absolutely right that if we come at it with this approach of you got to put your life on the line, we're going to go out fighting these capitalists or whatever, then yeah, it's not exactly the best sales pitch. And it also it comes off as kind of larpy to a large segment of the population. It comes off as people that want to have a cause to fight behind, that want to be revolutionary and want to prescribe some sort of meaning to their life that way. I fear that that's often how it comes off, when, again, as Hedges points out, the real tactics which ended up being the most effective in apartheid South Africa was striking, was actually putting the bodies not on the line as far as violence goes, but as far as using them collectively to deny that capitalist class their profits. And I think obviously so much can be learned from that here, because just like how the majority of South Africa was black, despite being oppressed by the white class, in America and obviously around the world, the majority of the people are proletariat. The majority of the people are not rich. They're not the 1%ers. It's the minority that are. So if we can come together in solidarity and unite behind a general strike, that's how we would get some results, not some crazy January 6th style, revolt on Capitol Hill. That's not going to get you anywhere. We found that out. We found out what happens to a movement that does that or tries to do that. It becomes a laughing stock, and then it justifies a massive increase in the security state.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes around to bite us in the ass, right? So I think that's a good place to wrap. We had a great chat today, and be back for our next fucking book club where we can talk about all of the shit that people on the Vanguard, or people say what the Vanguard never talks about.
Yeah, thanks so much for tuning in, guys, and special thanks to our patrons. Obviously, our patrons get to see these episodes first. We drop them on Thursday for the patrons, and then a few days later for everybody else. But yeah, the link's in the description if you'd like to join our Patreon community. This is one of the perks. So thanks so much, guys, and everyone have a great rest of your day.